Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're going to take a look at some battle tips for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, the new space RTS game set in the Warhammer 40k universe. Though there is a campaign portion to the game, today's tips focus solely on the actual engagements that take place in single and multiplayer in the hopes of helping you overcome all manner of challenges. I just want to mention really quickly as well that all of the footage I'm using is probably going to be from the previous beta builds of the game, so you shouldn't be paying attention to any of the numerical values. The reason I'm doing that is that so many of these tips are based off of multiplayer action, and I can't get enough of that if I'm using an exclusive review key. Now, if you've got any tips of your own, feel free to share them down below, and if you'd like to see this expand into a whole series, let me know down below as well by dropping a like and a comment. Now, without any time to waste, let's dive into these 10 essential tips for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 Battle Edition. Keep eyes on target. Knowledge is power, knowing is half the battle. There are countless thoughts that say the same thing, and no matter which way you want to put it, it's undeniably true that it helps to know what your enemy is up to at any given time. There are a variety of ways to see an enemy ship, and spotting an enemy ship comes at two levels. Unless they're using stealth in one way or another, such as using the running silent stance or by virtue of being a Tyrannid ship, or by hiding in an asteroid or gas field, enemy ships will show up as red blips of slightly varying sizes. The size of the blip corresponds to the size of the ship, and if you click on the blip, you can quickly tell which ones are larger because you'll be able to target systems on the bigger ships despite not knowing exactly what it is. Then, there's actually having a visual confirmation of the enemy. This is when you can actually see the ship model, allowing you to target it with your own ship's main weapons, and allowing you to see all of the systems, weapons, and abilities that that ship has. To get a visual confirmation of the enemy, you either need to get them within your detection radius or scanning radius if they're stealthed. These are both shown by the blue lines around each of your ships and the red and orange lines around enemy ships. You can also send a probe from your flagship if you have it equipped, or you can use the scan ability available on most escort ships and some line ships to mark targets for a short duration. This will allow you to see and track those marked targets for that short duration. You can send fighter squadrons to scout as well, or you can wait for the enemy ship to perform a maneuver that reveals their ship, such as full speed ahead or a high-speed turn. Since your weapon ranges are typically significantly higher than your detection ranges, you're going to want to get eyes on the enemy well before they're within detection range. I try to send a probe out to the largest collection of blips I see right at the start of the match. Usually, I try to plant it at the capture point nearest to this set of blips, since probes take time to get to their destination, and though they'll detect everything along the way, I want to make sure that they don't end up far away from everything at their final destination. If I can't see any blips, I wait until a point starts being captured by the enemy, and then I send probes towards it immediately to see what's performing the capture. Usually it'll be some escort ships, but sometimes it might be, in the case of Tyrannid or Necron, some larger ships as well. Now keep in mind that the probe isn't just available by default, you actually have to equip it before you start the game. Now I tend to bring it anytime I'm relying on range and looking to keep my distance from the enemy. I also try to use some smaller ships, running silent to stay hidden, sending them ahead to mark and reveal threats. And if my fleet doesn't have these smaller ships, I'll sometimes spread myself out so that the scanning ranges aren't overlapping and my coverage of the battlefield is as large as possible. Another thing I like to do, though it's not as guaranteed to succeed, is send out any fighter squadrons I have to act as scouts. Unless these ships get intercepted and destroyed before getting close enough to the enemy, they act well enough as probes. You can even directly target a blip for them to chase after rather than an arbitrary region of space. Beware though, as you only have a limited number of fighter and bomber squadrons available, and you don't want to waste them scouting if you have other options. And finally, I like to use bombs, nova cannons, and torpedoes to sometimes force an overreaction from my enemy, getting them to use a high-energy maneuver that reveals their position. Each fleet will have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to its ability to spot or hide from the enemy. Learn yours and command accordingly. Watch out for asteroid fields, watch out for gas clouds. You always need to scout those out. You never know when something is hiding in the shadows to destroy you from behind. Accuracy over distance. As I briefly mentioned, your ship's firing ranges will typically be much higher than the detection radius around them. On top of that, by selecting the appropriate ability, this range can often be increased to an extreme degree, making for some very serious long-range weapons fire for certain weapons classes. However, don't mistake weapons fire for damage output, especially with certain weapon types, like the very common macro batteries. While lances and missiles are very to fairly accurate over large distances, often they have 100% accuracy across all distances, macro batteries are more like shotguns. Their accuracy drops significantly over distance. By hovering over the weapons while building your fleet, or when in action, you'll be able to see just how accuracy changes over distance. It comes in a few different ratings, and as you can see, there are cases where a weapon might not hit at all, even though it can fire at a target. Keep in mind that there are abilities that counteract the reduction in accuracy, and if you're really planning on keeping your distance, you should consider using these to your advantage. You should also keep in mind that some factions are able to reduce enemy accuracy. Holofields, for example, reduce incoming macro battery fire accuracy by up to 50%. So, learn the ideal engagement ranges of the factions, learn when it's safer to keep a distance, and know when you need to close the gap. Learn firing arcs. Every offensive weapon or action in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 is limited by firing angles and distance. Torpedoes fire forward and spread wide over time, as indicated by the lines that are displayed when you hover over the Fire Torpedoes button. They don't work for the first little bit after they get launched, and you can tell that apart by seeing where this line is red versus blue, blue meaning active. Some weapons only fire off to the sides, and some only fire in a narrow arc to the front, and some will have a 270-degree firing arc facing forward. At times, a faction ability or stance might increase the firing radius or range of a certain weapon type, making it significantly more potent if used correctly. There's a lot to learn, and it definitely helps to have some basics memorized so you're able to respond to an evolving situation quickly. If you're forgetting your and your enemy's firing arcs though, you can easily check by hovering over the weapon icons in the detailed unit info screen. This works for friendly and hostile ships, and it lets you know exactly where you do or do not want to be. A good rule of thumb is to try and get behind enemy ships. Not only is the armor typically weaker at the rear, but it is typically a blind spot for weapons as well. Remember to use abilities that increase angles and ranges of fire at appropriate times. They can mean the difference between not putting out any damage and being the only one putting out damage. Keep in mind also that just because you've selected one target by actively right-clicking on it, it doesn't mean that your other guns will just sit silent. A front-facing weapon can fire independently while your starboard side fires at one target and your port side fires at another. Use this to your advantage. Position yourself in a way that as many guns as possible are firing as often as possible. Move between enemy ships to fire at two at a time, or rotate quickly if you're using broadsides so that you're not wasting time reloading on one side and instead firing from one side, turning around, firing from the other side while reloading the first, and then just keep spinning in 360 degrees until everybody gets dizzy and starts to throw up everywhere, I suppose. Basically, you want to keep adjusting orders to keep enemies within firing arcs, ensuring that your guns are quiet for as little time as possible. And try to do this all while staying out of the deadliest firing arcs that the enemy has as well. You won't be able to avoid all damage, but you can certainly minimize it. Don't underestimate troop damage. With battles taking place between several kilometer-long ships, damaging the crew within might sound negligible, but it's often the most powerful weapon in your arsenal. Typically, your larger ships will be able to launch boarding parties in two ways: a regular boarding maneuver and a lightning strike. The former requires you to be much closer to the enemy with a much narrower effective angle on either side of the performing ship. The latter has a much larger radius and can be performed in 360 degrees around the performing ship. The former is guaranteed to cause more troop damage than the latter, however, and you only have, at most, 3 uses of each type of action available. So read the numbers here, stay up to date with these numbers because they'll probably be getting balanced often. So keep an eye on these numbers, see how they change, and think about just how much troop damage you need to cause before you send a larger boarding party than you need to, ultimately wasting charges of these very useful abilities. In some cases, your ships will have boarding torpedoes that can also cause troop damage, but need to be fired like torpedoes. Larger ships with hangar bays will include strike craft that cause troop damage if they're able to get close enough to an enemy ship without being intercepted or shot down by defensive turrets. And some faction abilities, such as Honor the Chapter on the Space Marines, act as another form of boarding maneuver. Meanwhile, some Tyranid ships have feeding tentacles that will very quickly eat troops on a targeted enemy ship for as long as they're attached. potentially without revealing the offending NID. When it comes to regular boarding actions and lightning strikes, some factions are better at it than others, of course, so make sure you check troop efficiency when building your fleet. This will tell you how much troop damage ships of different sizes will cause with a successful boarding action. Keep an eye out for brutal strike abilities that increase critical assault chances, and you'll also notice that some factions have ships with attributes that give a chance of higher troop damage being caused. Don't ignore this modifier. Using a combination of these abilities, you can reduce a ship's troop count very quickly, and this has a couple of effects. For one, when the troop count of a ship is reduced by a third, skill and weapons cooldowns are increased by 10% and it suffers a critical hit. Reduced by 2/3, cooldown increases by 20% and the ship suffers 2 critical hits. And finally, when the troop count hits 0, the ship becomes a drifting hulk, or in the case of Tyranids, it dies and explodes. Drifting hulks aren't useless though. A drifting hulk can be reclaimed by boarding it with friendly troops, using either of the, or any of the boarding methods I should say, or it can be scuttled, causing a massive explosion that can do a tremendous amount of damage in a small radius around it. A reclaimed ship is very easy to reduce to a drifting hulk once again, however, as only one troop is added to the drifting hulk to bring it back online. Something to keep in mind though, not all factions are created equal when it comes to boarding. Before you get close enough to board the enemy, which is also typically close enough for the enemy to board you, you need to consider troop efficiency and the additional methods of causing troop damage that a faction might have. This means that 2 ships can send the same number of boarding actions against each other, and one will come out on top if they're of 2 different factions with enough of a disparity in troop quality. Learn the differences in troop efficiency and realize when you have the advantage and when you're the underdog. A battle can quickly turn with well-used mass crew damage, especially if it's on an enemy flagship. And finally, keep in mind that the option to execute mutineers involves reducing your own troop count by 1/3 of its maximum count. This is a very devastating blow, and you should try using the rally ability on your flagship if possible instead. Unfortunately, that only works within a radius, so sometimes heads must roll. Ramming is a viable tactic. Battlefleet does an excellent job of integrating ship ramming in a way that feels both satisfying and effective. A single maneuver can wipe out multiple ships if done correctly, and it can be the difference between victory and defeat. The game looks at the maximum hull points of a ship as well as its velocity and compares it with that of everything it hits. Important to note is that the game considers velocity, not overall speed. That means direction matters. Skidding into something with your side is nowhere near as efficient as ramming it head on. That's pretty self-explanatory, I think, but worth pointing out just to be clear. Also, since max hull points are accounted for, this means a small ship is more likely to destroy itself than cause any damage if you use it to ram for some reason. You'll want to switch to brace for impact stance before you go on a ramming rampage or before you get hit, because that will negate all damage to morale and it'll also ensure that you take less hull damage on impact. Ramming into larger ships can create a huge dent, literally and metaphorically speaking, softening them up for ranged fire or for boarding and assault craft action. If your faction relies on large, slow ships, make sure you time your uses of maneuvers properly. It can be very easy and frustrating to miss. Be patient, make sure you're going to get that hit in, and only then should you hit the big red button or its inferior equivalents with all the other factions as well. Always use lock on target. This is the little button down over here, a button that I'm personally a huge fan of as it allows you to see what your current target is and it allows you to maintain that target as you move around. If you know your firing angles and you know your firing ranges and you're half decent at micromanagement, you'll be able to maximize your fleet's efficiency, tailoring all of their actions. Without this being active, ships are firing and moving based on your preset orders at the bottom left corner, including engagement range, engagement angle, and engagement sides. I find it very easy to lose sight of things with it off though, and I sometimes feel like my attack orders are being superseded by fresh move orders. I prefer having more precise control so that I can opt between broadsides and shots from the front firing angles depending on the target I'm up against. Plus, the red line of firing angles tells you your maximum engagement range as well, which is quite helpful on approach. I just want to clarify here, I've heard some people hate using it, so this one should be tested out and applied to taste. Take this tip with a grain of salt, basically. Change stances often. This one can easily slip away in the heat of battle, but you need to remember to switch between your 3 or 4 stances. Not all stances are available to all ships, and not all stances are available to all factions, so I'll try and keep the advice here somewhat generic. Typically, your escort ships will have a running silent option available to them, and some line ships will have this option available as well. Running silent lets your ship fly around and attack in stealth mode. That means that their blips can't be seen at all, and the ships can only be ID'd when within an enemy's scanning range, which is the inner circle, not the outer detection ring, just as a reminder. It's very close. It's very close. Now, when ships are running silent, they are revealed momentarily when firing, but apart from that, they can sneak around pretty freely, and you can keep their deployment hidden by setting running silent on during the deployment phase. Lock-on stance is great to have active on your line ships during the earlier stages of a battle. It typically increases the ranges of your weapons, and the equivalent for some factions will sometimes increase firing angles as well. It can help increase accuracy too, and it's great to get you started on the right foot. In some cases, you'll want to keep this active if you're playing as a faction that wants to keep its distance at all times. Reload stance is the one you'll likely spend the most time in the average faction, and it's worth switching to this when the engagements begin in earnest in close range. Reload stance makes sure you're firing faster, it benefits your maneuvers, make sure you're recharging them faster as well, and overall just bumps up your efficiency in close range combat. This can and will make a world of difference. If two equivalent ships are going toe-to-toe and one is using reload stance while the other is not, one of those ships is going to be causing a lot more damage than the other. Then there's the brace for impact stance. This is great if you're about to ram or be rammed, or if you're about to travel through an asteroid field for some reason or another. Not only does this reduce the amount of damage that the hull takes, but it also completely negates any morale damage caused by this type of impact. The other use for brace for impact is when the enemy has sent fighter squadrons towards your ship. The accuracy of your turrets will be bumped up in this stance, and you'll dispose of enemy strike craft a lot faster. As stated, there are some stances that are unique to certain factions. The Eldari, for example, can increase their firing angles of certain weapons to 270 degrees facing forward. The Necron can activate a hull regeneration stance to help repair and heal their ships. Make sure you read all the generic and faction-specific stances that are available and keep them top of mind. You'll want to switch them around as the battle develops to ensure you're always working your ships the right way. Target the right systems. This is something easily missed when first getting used to the game, and it's something that needs to be made into a habit. Battlefleet Gothic Armada has a pretty simple but effective method in place that allows ships to target specific systems of enemy ships when firing. Picking a system to target is as simple as selecting the enemy ship and choosing which of the systems to prioritize in this menu down here. Not all will be available at all times, depending on the ship and faction you're targeting, and escort ships don't have any systems to target. When a critical hit takes place, the targeted system gets damaged. It's a dice roll, sometimes it'll be a different system. It is a little randomized, there is some RNG. But in the case of escort ships, a critical hit is instant destruction, so there's no need to pick systems there. By default, your ships are set to target a random system. Your options include the deck, the engines, the generators, and the weapons. Destroying an enemy deck will prevent them from using stances unless they have a special faction ability like the Necron, and it'll also hit them with morale damage where applicable. Destroying engines will slow enemy ships down and will also prevent them from using any of their maneuvers. Destroying generators will shut down shields and hollow fields and regeneration capabilities, and then destroying weapons will close down hangar bays, and it'll prevent the use of weapon abilities including Tyrannid hooks and torpedoes and the like. Damage to systems actually happens in two stages: light damage followed by complete destruction. Light damage happens first, and it has some reduced effects on the enemy systems, and it can be repaired using the appropriate ability. Destruction, meanwhile, is permanent, and it causes more severe trouble to the enemy ship. Systems also take damage when troop damage crosses a threshold. This implies that a boarding party or the bomber squadron managed to do some critical damage, and this can be exceptionally helpful. Pick the systems to target based on your strategy and who you're up against. Are you relying on lightning strikes that can't penetrate shields? Maybe focus on enemy generators first. Are you dealing with a fast foe that keeps using maneuvers to get away from you? Try destroying their engines. Are the Tyrannids threatening you with feeding tentacles? Focus down their weapons. I typically focus down generators or engines first, depending on who I'm up against. It's also important to keep in mind that once a system has been destroyed, you need to go in and pick a new one to focus your efforts on. Stay on top of this, and you can systematically destroy your foe. Fires are extremely dangerous. This one is short and sweet. If you see that there is a fire on board one of your ships, try to use the repair action as soon as possible. Fires are temporary, but they cause damage to health and morale, and that damage can pile up a lot faster than you might think. I try and save repair actions until the fires start if possible, as there's no other way to get rid of them. Make sure you use fires to your advantage as well. Some factions have various traits or abilities that cause fires, while others will have access to weapons like Melta torpedoes that cause fires as well. This extra touch of damage over time can make a world of difference and will sometimes allow you to ignore an old target as it burns to death from the inside. Escape the battlefield. When in doubt, get out. The destruction of a ship gives your opponent the full point value of that ship added to their tally. True at all times, but especially in close games, that sudden jump in points can be the difference between life and death, victory and defeat, to be less melodramatic. So, when a high-value ship is close to destruction, you might be better off evacuating it by clicking this button here. It takes some time, and your ship is a sitting duck as it prepares to leave, but if you manage to get out, the enemy only receives, I believe, half the points of destroying the ship, though I believe there's talk of maybe making it 0 points at all, and that can buy you some very valuable time. Unfortunately, evac isn't always perfect. It can be interrupted, it can fail, or it can be catastrophic, destroying the ship entirely. You can also interrupt enemy evac. I typically do so by using a boarding action, normally a lightning strike, though if I'm not mistaken, getting a critical hit does the trick too. So, if you ever feel that the Emperor or whatever god you worship has forsaken you, it might be best to hurry away from the enemy and try your luck with evacuation. I hope these tips set you up for success, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you have any tips of your own to share, drop them in the comments down below. If there's enough interest in a series, I'll be doing a full beginner's guide for the game, including faction guides, so let me know by dropping a like down below as well. Apart from that, I'd like to thank all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis, and I'd like to thank all of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.